So, welcome everybody to our panel on the crisis of contemporary capitalism and civil society. As already mentioned, we are very lucky to have Maurice Glasman, the founder of Blue Labour, among other things. Francis Foley, the deputy director of the think tank Compass, and Dr. Paul Tyson, a philosophical theologian from the University of Queensland. I have to tell you that Lord Griffiths, Brian Griffiths, was intending to be with us, but he is unwell, and he's really gutted about that. And he wanted to remind you all that it was in this college 75 years ago this year in which T.S. Eliot gave his lectures, which became the idea of a Christian society, in which he asked whether our society was, I quote, assembled round anything more permanent than a congery of banks, insurance companies, and industries, and had it any beliefs more essential than a belief in compound interest and the maintenance of dividends. So join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers who will address this same question. And first of all, Maurice.
So I only found out I was doing this at about 11:30 last night, so forgive me. Hi, Katja. Good to see you. And so first of all, I'd like to thank Adrian, James, John, Alison. For me, this feels like a dream world bar mitzvah, where extended family get together, and as Marlon Brando said in The Godfather, you meet old friends, make new friends, and ensure that business goes smoothly in the future. So it's really wonderful to be here, and also really honoured to be in a Telos. Telos, between around 1968 and 1972, was a really important magazine. I think Alistair McIntyre wrote, what was it, Epistemological Crisis, Dramatic Narrative and the History of Science in Telos. And I think that remains one of the best essays on getting beyond Kuhnian conception of paradigm change, where he said that it was absolutely essential to understand what was the problem with the previous paradigm, what was the problem with your own, in order to develop a new way of understanding the world. I think this is a very relevant essay for where we are now. We're certainly moving into this is a dilemma. One of the problems with the contemporary moment is that new is an old and outdated word. We don't want to repeat the intellectual disasters of new labour or anything like that, but we are certainly living in a time where we have to retrieve concepts from the old era, understand the glory of the inheritance that we have in order to make sense of the world. I also really want to welcome Michael Lind, Sarah Bamari, Wolfgang Streck, because we are internationalists, not globalists, and we absolutely welcome you and to the family here. And it's also great, this is the university I went to. I absolutely hated it. This is where I discovered my own class consciousness. I didn't really know about it till I got here. I thought that everybody was a bit like me. I was wrong. And I definitely felt I was not like them. So, and then obviously I've had a lifetime to try and reconcile. So what I can say is, it's wonderful to be in Cambridge. The durability of its beauty is not capable of being dismantled, not even by its academics. So, and to move on, before I get just to capitalism, I just want to pick up on a few things that were said earlier. So I'm very ambivalent about post-liberalism as a concept, because I've never been a liberal, so how could you be a post-liberal? And also, just to say, liberalism is the enemy of liberty. This is my absolute conviction. I don't think any academic here can really honestly say that they are free to express their views. I think that there's policing of language, policing of views, that universities are certainly no longer the centre of intellectual creativity and thought. I think that's coming from outside the university sphere, and I think that's all to be laid at the door of oppressive authoritarian liberalism. And also this idea of civil society has got to be interrogated again. To my friends from Poland, I understand its importance and greatness when you're dealing with resistance to communism, but in contemporary capitalist modernity, civil society are philanthropic and state-funded NGO groups who represent no one other than progressive authoritarians. And that's a real issue that we've got to look at. So I prefer to use the concept of society and then analyse different forms of societal self-organisation and, to whoever spoke earlier, interest representation. Because what you have had in the old era, which was the era of globalisation, is the suppression of working class interests entirely by these NGOs and think tanks and civil society organisations that just promote the interests of the educated and the wealthy within a framework where they promote an ideology of division and not solidarity around the sort of identity politics that John Crudder spoke about. So I really want to particularly welcome Wolfgang Streeck, who's been a tremendous inspiration to so many of us over so many years, and to express an almost a lament for your country and what has happened to this beautiful self-organisation of interests that has been entirely usurped by an EU progressive authoritarianism that is in fact disintegrating your society. So we are there with you for whatever emerges on the other side of this, but it's no longer that the whole thing with Mitbestimmung, with co-determination, with the Handwerk, with the artisan representation in the organisation of the labour force, with the Sparkassen, with the way that the German working class could have genuine representation in the national economy of what was West Germany, has now been evaporated, disintegrated, and with consequences that are yet to be fully apprehended. So I wanted to just say hi, good morning. Those are a few opening remarks that have been on my mind from the morning session, to stress again not to turn to liberalism as a defence of liberty, because liberalism has become an ideology that views the individual as outside of constraint and relationship on the one side, so it's a very uncivil ideology, and secondly has no means of understanding or analysing the power of capitalism, which is the main thing that I'm going to talk about today. And then again to interrogate civil society and begin to think about how it is that the market and the state disintegrate society. So civil society is like a simulacrum of society, a fake representation of society, and that doesn't represent interest. So what you have is that the working class have no political expression. And I think it's very important to acknowledge the enormity of Wolfgang. I think we could talk about, in Hegelian language, I love this language, it's not used anymore, a world historical victory for Trump. Okay, that this is something of epic dimensions, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, interfaith, working class coalition against progressives. Okay, that's the enormity of what we're talking about. Kamala Harris was for they, them. President Trump is for you. That's all you really need to know about the American election. And guess who won? Right, in every demographic, in every single, but above all, the biggest determinant of whether you voted for Donald Trump was whether you went to university or not. And I think that we must question the value of universities. If the meaning of going to university is you think that Kamala Harris was an intelligent, good candidate, we have to ask fundamental questions about what you are teaching your students. It's pathetic. It's really a pathetic, degraded outcome. I mean, my sister said to me, Maurice, how can you even smile about it? You know, the lack of understanding, the lack of humour, the idea that the Democrats represented anything else other than the perpetuation of eternal capitalism and progressive rule of the working class. That's the meaning of Kamala Harris. And I noticed, Sorab told me that Donald Trump last night issued a really fantastic tweet, which went like, I understand everything about automation, everything. And he met with the head of the Longshoremen Union, the dockers, and he said, and we're not going to have automation of the docks because it's too much human cost. Can you imagine a Labour government or a Democrat government opposing technological innovation in the name of working class interests? But this is the space that we're moving into. I do think, just to share with you, that the only place to build a house now is on the left side of Maga Square. And there's two reasons for that. That's where the energy is. Also, that's where the political contestation will go on. There's an inherent contest within Trumpism between transhumanist oligarch billionaires and some concept of building condos on Mars. And then there's a basically working class Catholic resistance that wants a stable life, a good life, that wants liberation from progressive authoritarianism. And that's the space I think that we need to be engaged with. And the great advantage of it is you don't need to talk to liberals anymore. Right? You don't have to be worried about this and concerned about that, and more definitions of neutrality and impartiality when it comes to a completely bent legal system. You can just begin to do politics, and a working class politics, and a politics of interests. I think this is happening now in England. I mean, reform is sweeping through the working class. Small towns, big towns, Wales, we're going to be looking, there were by-elections last night. The contest is going to be between Labour and Reform. I know John rates Kemi Badenoch highly, and I think she says interesting things, but I don't think people are really listening to the Conservative Party anymore. I think 1 million migrants a year for 4 years on the basis of take back control has really smashed their credibility, conceivably for a generation. So, and there's one more thing that I wish to break the news to you. The old era was an era of innovation. I've never known what innovation means. It's just a word that keeps on coming, a bit like sustainability. Remember, innovation, sustainability. This is what academics here will know. What inclusivity. Academics here will know this jargon of, what do they say about Kamala Harris? Word salad, inclusivity, innovation, and all of that. Really, we're living now in an age of invention, of new things, built out of old things. That's the space that we're going to move into. So just a brief summary is liberalism is the enemy of liberty. Civil society is a state and philanthropic entity to replace the actual meaning of interests and contestation and pluralism in society. But I think that the very distinctive form of politics that we have to develop, on just a dissent from T.S. Eliot, when he talks about banks, insurance companies and industries. I agree with him on the banks and the insurance companies, but I like industry. So I want to stick up for that the new era is going to be an era of production. And the meaning of contemporary capitalism, particularly from the era of globalization, I wish to say two fundamental things. And Alison, how long have I got? We never discussed this. Can I negotiate 4? Maybe 5. Adrian. Sorry, I had to say what I had to. So, 4, okay. I'll take my watch off. I'll time it. Okay, so 2 really, really crucial things to understand.
Actually, I should have said 3 in the spirit of negotiation. Let's say 3, Maurice.
Okay, 5 it is. And you can't say fairer than that. Okay, so the first thing is about contemporary. What we have to understand about the era of globalization and its meaning is that the inherited capital of the United States and of Britain, and to some extent of Western Europe, was actually transferred and invested in empowering the Chinese Communist Party. The meaning of contemporary capitalism is that it has underwritten a system where there's no free and democratic trade unions, no limits on the exploitation of workers, no freedom of religion, no liberty. That's the dream world of capitalism. Maximum returns at the greatest possible speed. So we have to understand the moment we're in, that industry matters, that China has a tremendously powerful industry, and we, collectively, the meaning of capitalist progressivism is the empowerment of the most repressive communist party in the history of the world. Thatcher was really, really good at standing up to Soviet communism, but absolutely empowered Chinese communism. This is and this can't be reversed by policy. This is the contemporary reality, I think apprehended much more by Trump than by the progressive wing. So that's the first thing to say about contemporary capitalism, is that this is the way this is a very liberal move. Okay, what is the meaning of liberalism? To extricate yourself from difficult relationships into a sphere of freedom. That's the meaning. Patriarchy, sexism, but above all, powerful trade unions, state regulation. You just move into a sphere of freedom. The Chinese Communist Party offered capital that sphere of freedom. 24-hour-a-day production, no strikes, no impediment on relentless industrial production. So the meaning of communism is the exploitation of the working class. The meaning of capitalism is its alliance with communism. Right? That's the fundamental argument that I'm making. So, comrades, the stakes are high. So we confront ourselves within a society that COVID, John Crowdis mentioned COVID, there was a moment of awareness that we were entirely dependent on China, even for face masks. Do you remember? We couldn't even, let alone ventilators or anything like that. That kind of arose to consciousness and kind of disappeared, I think, at the same moment as Black Lives Matters arose. It was a classic move. But that's really fundamental to understand. The second fundamental thing is the eternal issue of capitalism is all that is solid melts into air and everything holy is profaned. It's a system of commodification of human beings and of nature, and a relentless exploitation of those things, which brings back to John Crowdis's point, which is that everything holy is profaned. It completely desecrates the human condition, and it leads to, it's to use a really lovely progressive word, unsustainable, and that is what leads to the clinging to any form of solidarity that can prevent that. Obviously, those of us who are faithful to the socialist tradition, to the Labour tradition, to the tradition of Catholic social thought, to an Aristotelian tradition, we look to forms of association and solidarity as a resistance to the remorseless pressure of capital to commodify. But if that's not there, then you get fascism and different forms of authoritarian states that can offer some resistance to that. Look, Adrian, I'm done. So listen, very good. Good morning, and really good to be here. Thank you.
Can I shut that? No. I'm trying to squeeze my notes on here. Hi everyone, it's good to be with you. My name's Francis and I am Deputy Director at an organisation called Compass. But today I'm actually not going to talk to you about Compass because I knew this would please Maurice. Because when I was preparing for this, and I'm really excited to be here amongst many people I've read and felt like I've been in dialogue with over a number of years but never actually met, I was thinking a lot about the place in which, in civil society, you know, this is the title of the panel, I'd learnt the most about the prospects for the future and space for the common good. And so actually today I'm going to talk a little bit about settlement houses. because I live in the only surviving settlement house in the UK which has all of its original elements. It's a place called Pembroke House. It's in South London near the Elephant Castle, and it's been continuously existing since 1885, despite everything and through everything. So today I'm going to say three brief things. One is to kind of situate settlement houses in this conversation about common good, and particularly about democracy as practice. Secondly, to kind of draw out some of those hallmarks of the settlement tradition which I think are still relevant today, and where we can extract them and continue to practice them and use them in other spaces. And thirdly, to kind of remark upon, many of you might be sitting in the audience thinking, I've never heard of settlement houses. You're not alone. If this is you, don't worry. You know, there are many of us out there I had never heard of settlement houses before I came to live in one. And I'm fascinated by why this tradition has become so forgotten and so lost. And so in my concluding remarks, I'll say something about why I think these why the settlement houses have been forgotten, as a flip side of saying why they are now still relevant, because I think they have relationships to one another. So to start, I'll just say something about what a settlement house is. So settlement houses were a kind of movement, social movement at the 1880s and 90s. They started here in the UK with Toynbee Hall, which many of you might have been to, still exists. And they spread very quickly to North America. And in North America, they became sites, kind of hothouses of kind of working class solidarity, interestingly. And I'll say much more about class and class solidarity in a second. They were kind of spaces of a trade movement activity, suffragist power, and also spaces where new social reforms were kind of dreamt up and organised and explored. And they had three pillars. So the first pillar was a program of social action. So what was beautiful about going to Chicago and Hull House was to see that actually their social program was very, very similar to my current social program at Pembroke House. So lunch clubs, music clubs, reading groups, gardening groups. The same ideas of the good life still populate, still kind of working class, what people turn to and what people orient to. The second thing was they had a space for worship, and we'll come back to that in a second. Most of these have been decoupled from the settlement houses now, and I think drawing on John Cruddas' remarks earlier in the previous panel, we'll think about that idea of the sacred. And the third is that they had a residency, which is where I currently live. Residents lived there for a period of, 1 year up to sort of 40 years, it seemed like, in Chicago, and they got subsidised rent in return for some of their labour going to help keeping the community house going. But to just set all of this for a moment in context, my favourite quote from this year is from a political theorist called Valerie Bunce. And she said that in a democratic system, we're asking people to accept uncertainty over outcome for certainty over process. So uncertainty over the outcome of what to be delivered for certainty over that process. And that thought has been going around my head. That quote has been sort of just circulating for the past few months, especially since the election. And what I drew from that was two main things. One was that it made me feel very strongly resistant to the current Labour government betting the entire farm on deliverism, essentially, because not only is that insufficient for people, but precisely, but it is also increasingly hard to deliver on in a world of sort of so much turmoil. And secondly, then it made me think about the second part of that, which is certainty over process. And of course, with the American election not long past, we were all reminded of the fact that there was great uncertainty over that process. People didn't actually believe that, and you'll see in polling numbers, which were extremely high about the number of Americans who thought there might be a civil war following the process. But then the way that this is connected back to the kind of the smallest unit, which is the settlement house, is that it makes me think about how we need to not think about democratic processes, obviously just as electoral politics and electoral voting, but we need to think of them as something much thicker. And here I'm reminded of Geoffrey Green's thought about the eyes of the people and how politics as spectacle has become some of the ways in which people actually have a relationship to politics and democracy nowadays. So he talks about the people as being ocular rather than vocal, of watching things as passive recipients and passive kind of audience members. And I'm interested in how we think about politics as practice and politics as participation. And Also needless to say that in this country, Labour might feel they're on solid ground with such a huge majority, but of course when you win a majority on 34% of the vote, historically low turnout and historically disproportionate election, that is extremely questionable. So the three characteristics I think of settlement house that are worth us considering. For the first, so my experience at Pembroke House is characterised by a kind of messiness. That's the word I kept going back to. It's slightly chaotic and it's slightly loose. And I think that is important in a substantive way. It means it's extremely non-hierarchical. This was a tradition that started from middle-class social reformers in universities like this. The reason it's called Pembroke House, by the way, is because it's linked to Pembroke College in Cambridge. Not that they ever give us any money, but I'll leave that one for later. They understood that they deeply didn't understand the lives of the people whose social reforms were meant to be changing. And some of the more radical among them, and more egalitarian among them, decided to go and live amongst the poor. Now, of course, there was a lot of class friction in this. I don't mean to say this was some kind of beautiful come-by-our moment of middle class and working class coming together. And in fact, a lot of the writings of some of the most famous settlement house practitioners, such as Jane Addams in the States, really attest to the number of ways in which the middle-class social reformers put their foot in their mouth. So one of my favourite ones was that they started this healthy eating club. I mean, yeah, these good ideas never fail, right? So the healthy eating club, and then one of the incredible quotes from the women involved was like, we're sticking with what we have because we'd rather eat what we'd rather, right? So they were just saying, actually, screw your salads, we're going to stick with our fried bread. And she wrote a long essay about what she learned from this, and I thought that was kind of beautiful. But they're extremely non-hierarchical spaces, and they're also non-didactic. So what I mean by that is that the program of social activities was tested, it was invitational, but it was also kind of withdrawn when things were not popular. And in fact, the working class neighbours who were in and around these communities were actively encouraged to start their own, to be self-organised and to start their own clubs and societies. So we have a beautiful mix of kind of the societies involved in this. And you might just think there were things like gardening clubs and healthy eating groups, but in fact, a lot of them became radical in their social demands and political demands. And I'll say more about that in a second. The second is that they were avowedly cross-class. So as I've said, these people who came from these academic institutions and went into the slum area, but they really understood that this was actually as much an act of saving themselves, about the rich saving themselves rather than saving the poor. And I think that is deeply relevant to today, not least because as someone who comes from a place which is often called left behind, the town of Oldham, you can see Manira in the audience as well, I strongly reject this idea of the sort of left behind neighbourhood, not least because when you look at something like the Brexit vote, which is often talked about in this sort of socially neglect framing, you look at the numbers of Brexit voters who came from places which were not normally termed left behind, but more affluent suburbs, where if you look at the correlation between the levels of social infrastructure and community in those places and the levels of dissatisfaction and disengagement from politics, I think you draw a different conclusion, which is simply that actually we, look at working class people as, we pathologize working class people and think that they are the people who need the social infrastructure. In fact, I think I would argue that middle class and rich neighbourhoods are the people who need to be more in touch with their working class neighbours. And thirdly, I would say, so actually just on the class element, the level of that is also down to what David Goodhart has written a lot about with this head, hand, heart distinction. Social settlements are places where there's a lot of emphasis on the head and the hand and the heart. People are not necessarily revered for their cognitive or cerebral abilities or their abilities to talk in venues like this, but are in fact often elevated as community leaders when they can fix things and when they can organise things and when they can care for people and when they're relational and can hold good conversations. And I think that's extremely important. And as somebody who tried to organise a 600-person street party just last summer, I can attest to the power of the head, hand and heart, which takes everything from you. And finally, I think really important for our conversation today, settlements were always spaces which have been unembarrassed about putting forward a clear idea of the good and what the good life is about, as is reflected in their programs of social activity. But it's also avowedly political. Jane Addams came to a lot of trouble because she invited Kropotkin. So amidst all of these sort of dining clubs and, sewing classes, there was also Kropotkin just giving a lecture down the hall. And she got blacklisted, actually, for a while. The Chicago Press had an absolute field day with that. But quietly, under the surface, there was a lot of political animation happening in these spaces. And I think that is something that we overlook, thinking that community organisations must restrict themselves to lunch clubs and dance classes, which, important as they are, do not often connect to the political realm. So finally, to say something about this contemporary relevance, these spaces have been lost to history, I think, for three reasons, and three reasons which should give us pause to understand their relevance for today. Firstly, the welfare state. So Clement Attlee and Beveridge met each other at Toynbee Hall when he was working as a subwarden. And in fact, there's a deep irony that the people who were really boiled in the water of settlement houses, which really informed their politics. Anyone who's read Attlee's The Social Worker will know that he was deeply affected by what he saw in the East End and really deeply shaped his politics. But there is an irony to the fact that these are the pioneers of the welfare state who went on to create a state which came overweening and managed to squash a lot of local activity. And I refer you to kind of Beveridge's second later report, I prefer his later work, which is where he says, I regret that we didn't do enough about localism and keeping things anchored in community. And these were from people who had lived the experience directly themselves. And we were seeing this return now to locality now. Localism is on the rise, and I think there's a lot of interesting contestations to happen there in terms of our politics. Secondly, and perhaps for me the most interesting part of this, is this public-private blurring that happens at settlement houses. So these were spaces that were predominantly run by women. And they were run by women because women who are politically active could use the space of the kind of veneer of domesticity to say that what we're just doing is we're just helping the local children to get a good education. In fact, what they were doing under the surface was deeply radical and deeply political. And I think you're seeing this interesting question about the public-private begin to blur now. Obviously, since the pandemic, we've had increasing visibility of questions about care, not just for our youngest in society, but for our oldest. And indeed, this debate around assisted dying, which we've talked about earlier, is also something that's animated a lot of people because it touches on the idea of the sacred, but also on the sense of the public and private, which needs to come out. And finally, this lost art of mutual aid. So people now think about mutual aid, which has become once again popular since the pandemic, as some sort of charity. And the clue is in the name there, folks. If it ain't mutual, it's not mutual aid. And what we saw at our settlement house was that this was a space where middle-class people were the late arrivals to the party. So there were already flourishing working-class networks of people supporting each other in our community. But suddenly, during the pandemic, middle-class people woke up, said, I don't know my neighbourhood, I don't know any of my neighbours, came down the street and found actually a thriving ecosystem where people could meet each other and support one another with what they had to give. So, and finally, just to say on that, I think that's going to become increasingly important as we face issues of climate adaptation. I mean, communities are facing this alone in lots of spaces. Questions of flooding, as we've seen over the past few months, are very much left to communities. And rather than just being about parcels of food, this needs to be about survival for people. So thinking about where people's relationships are, who has the sandbags, who has the working landline, these are all going to become increasingly important as climate impacts intensify. So in conclusion, I think it brings me back to this question about process. And process something not as this liberal, technocratic, dry procedural thing, but process as something which is deeply enmeshed with this idea of the good. The reason I look to settlement houses still as offering us some sort of contemporary relevance is because they engage with questions of fragility, vulnerability, and care in a way that I think is radical and important. And I would ask that all institutions could take something of these characteristics. They could borrow this openness and embrace the messiness of true democracy. They could build these cross-class alliances which are genuinely mutual and solidaristic, and they could give us a sense of the common good and open up conversations about good and virtue in ways that would be genuinely meaningful to people. And I think all of that would mean that it would not give us certainty over process, because true certainty is impossible, but it would give us confidence back in the process, which is something that we desperately need. Thank you.
Great to be with you all. So I kind of with Maurice here, I've never really been liberal, but I'm approaching this from a kind of a philosophical angle, and I suppose Aristotle's sort of common sense approach to reality and Plato's common understanding of high meaning sort of really frame where I'm coming from, and then I try to apply that to the post-Enlightenment world. So I think you actually, there's a crisis of sacred in our times, but the sacred is always there. And I think the sacred heart of the neoliberal world is Heidegger's void. So there is an ontological problem, but it's not like it's not there. We do have a concept of a sacred something, which is the rejection of a sacred anything. So my little talk is a reflection on a verse of the scriptures, and to paraphrase it from Proverbs 29:18, this is a paraphrase: "Without a vision, the people purchase." Liberalism since Locke has been premised on the distinction between facts and meanings. Objective material facts can be reasonably verified by scientific and rational criteria, which anyone can independently affirm as at least functionally true. Subjective meanings, unlike objective facts, are matters about which reasonable people can disagree. This is because, to Locke, qualitative and metaphysical meanings have no objective truth criteria which anyone can methodologically and experimentally validate for themselves, unlike sensory, factual and logically rational verification, which can be universally validated. However, to Locke, this implied no full-blown subjectivising of meaning, for he was well aware that the common life required anchoring in a range of publicly affirmed belief and value commitments, however much one might privately disbelieve them. It's a very English approach. But let us not forget that the Hobbesian total monopoly of violent power by the state has always been an integral feature of modern liberalism. Only a certain range of private meaning commitments, those deemed publicly harmless by the state, were ever acceptable to modern liberalism. But whether we like it or not, we are post-liberal now. The fact-meaning distinction has gone. Judith Butler rejects the notion that nature and culture can be meaningfully isolated from each other. This entails the rejection of any rational and scientific objectivity as well. Butler holds that, for example, sex is a nature and culture co-construction. Butler holds that the traditional realist notion that there are only two sexes, male and female, and that these are objectively verifiable by scientific means is no longer tenable. For nature and its scientific knowledge is a human and linguistic construction as much as is the subjective and individual sense of gender identity. Accepting queer gender theory as valid, subjective gender identity now defines the meaning of biological sex in Australian law. Here, any trans woman legally identifying as a female is female. Further, actual females who understand themselves to be women because they are XX chromosomed females, have no right to discriminate against trans women who wish to enter female-only spaces. In Australian law, both subjective gender and objective sex are equally poetic, culturally embedded meaning glosses on a brutally given but essentially meaningless nature.
Could you say that sentence again?
Oh, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? It even starts on the other page.
Just nice and slow.
Okay. In Australian law, both subjective gender and objective sex are equally poetic, culturally embedded meaning glosses on a brutally given but essentially meaningless nature. We got that? Great. If you understood it, you weren't paying attention. A lot of that happens in academia. Queer gender identity ideology, as embedded in law, has effectively rendered the fact-meaning distinction of modern Australia obsolete. This renders liberalism obsolete in Australia. Australians are no longer free to have their own value and meaning beliefs about whether they agree with queer gender ideology. There are no objective facts that we can publicly agree on, which can be interpreted differently in the domain of personal meaning commitments. The law and public agency now defines what objective truth is, what public facts mean, and what moral convictions are mandatory. Welcome to the post-liberal future, with its new categories of state-controlled and publicly actionable orthodoxy and heresy. The sacred never goes away. Modern liberalism used also to be tacitly embedded in Christian cultural assumptions about public authority and meaning. The tacit collective categories of intrinsic human dignity derive from the imago Dei, and that's the real Dei, by the way, and the sacredness of truth as distinct from the interests of power are what enabled modern Western liberalism to produce agnostic and atheist antagonists of the Christian theological warrants of Western public life. Sorry, I do long sentences. Enter Thomas Huxley's X-Club and their 20th century progressive progeny. The de-Christianisation of public meaning was so effectively prosecuted by the Progressive Academy in the 20th century that come the 19th centuries and Western high culture, as well as Western mass media formed popular culture, have been de-Christianised. Yet after the de-Christianisation of the West, the unstated common value and meaning assumptions that made liberalism in some manner politically viable can no longer be coherently drawn on. Richard Dawkins recently engaged in a fascinating public discussion with Ayaan Ali. In that engagement, Dawkins acknowledged that he is a cultural Christian. This is a significant insight. I haven't found much that I find theologically insightful by Richard, but that was great. For, as Ali pointed out, it is Christianity formed Western culture's commitment to science as a fearless search for truth in which post-Huxleyan scientific atheism, emerged and flourished. Dawkins notices that were he to live under Sharia law, this would not allow him to advocate for scientific atheism. He thus recognises that he is a cultural Christian and he does not want to see the West lose its cultural Christianity. Until neoliberalism in the 1980s, modernity was never purely liberal in any ultimate sense, but presupposed a range of public and collectively assumed higher meanings that were theologically warranted. But now that the theological warrants of Western culture have been thoroughly white-handed by the very atheist liberals it allowed to flourish, anxiety about what happens next is clearly something on Dawkins' mind. Two of the central commitments on which positivist liberalism were built are now gone. There is no fact-meaning distinction, such that knowledge and meaning are collapsing into each other, and both have become metaphysically unmoored and pragmatically instrumentalised. And the high warrant in public life underpinning common meaning, the authority of the Church and Christian theology, has been abandoned by our elites. We are post-liberal now. Losing respect for factual and metaphysical truth and having to simply make up all meanings for ourselves, we are trying to make the accumulation of personal power and shopping the unifying principle of Western civilization. Without a vision, the people purchase. Welcome to postmodern neoliberalism. But this is not working. We are now living in an accelerating vortex of cultural and natural destruction, energised by enormous technological power, unguided by common categories of authority and wisdom. To save any viable form of modern Western liberalism, if that is possible or desirable, two things need to happen. Firstly, we need to rebuild a genuine respect for objective truth. Modern science has always been a pragmatic enterprise, but it was underpinned in early modernity by metaphysical convictions about God, which linked technological pragmatism in some manner to truth. That link is now broken, and I blame Kant for that. And we are in serious trouble as regards the post-metaphysical fusion of political and ideological agendas with the truth-unconcerned powers of modern technology. Secondly, we need in some manner to revive the almost dead high-meaning categories of Western public life. The modern West indeed was culturally Christian. Civilizations must have a spiritual and doxological centre. Maybe we at least need a moratorium on anti-Christian reform until we work out where we want to move forward from in this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panellists. I would like to give them a brief opportunity. I stress brief because we don't want our audience to be merely ocular. We want to give them a chance to get back. So beginning with Maurice, if you'd like to make a few brief comments, that would be wonderful.
Okay, so first of all, oh my, I'm not good with technology.
Do we have to do anything to these? No, they should work. Put it very close to your lips, like Elvis Presley.
That's, yeah. Yeah, that's a very personal question. Do you do anything with these? First of all, I'd like to say that, Francis, this is a really interesting, because the settlement houses were also the institutions against which Saul Alinsky in Chicago built community organisation. So I think that's a really welcome conversation. And so much of that 45 post-war settlement was absolutely Toynbee Hall. Christian socialism, really, to a large extent. And I think that Paul, the reason I asked you to repeat that sentence is I think that what Paul outlined was precisely the tyranny of liberalism. This is what I was talking. You still think that liberalism defends liberty. It's a force of tyranny, mind control, policing, surveillance, and then a legal order that makes it a criminal offence to dispute those categories. So liberalism has in fact become a system of social control and thought discipline. And I just again ask the academics here if that's their experience. You know, is that the truth? My experience was, in order to be free, I had to leave academia. It was impossible to function in that space any longer. And the behaviour of academic colleagues, I mean, I'll give one example. I was at the, right near Toynbee Hall, I was at London Met, which used to be City of London Poly. And we had we were called to a 3-line whip meeting, you know, which involved the two institutions that really hold the power, HR and curriculum development. Okay, those two academics are the two forces of totally Leninist control. And they said that we had to show an awareness of and respect for cultural diversity in everything that we taught, and we had to manifest this in our curriculum. So I said to the guy, I said, in South Africa there's an idea that if you rape an underage girl, you get cured of AIDS. I said, do you respect it? And he said to me, you're going to have to give me some time to think about that. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that none of my colleagues joined in. Right? That's liberalism. Authoritarian managerial control of free speech. So I just wanted to really thank you, Paul, for repeating the sentence, because that helped me clarify the meaning of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to try to weave together some threads, but I'm really keen to hear what has landed with the audience and how you're weaving the threads as well. I think to pick up what Maurice just said, and actually what Paul talked about, I'm interested in this idea of agonistic democracy and where you practice agonistic democracy, and that space for disagreement and lively disagreement. And I think sometimes, as you said, Maurice, like the settlement houses have been lumped in with the Fabian movement, and I think that's not fair. I think it's unfair. And the reason I think it's unfair is because they were very strident about setting up spaces for agonistic debate and for people to disagree lively disagreements were had. There were lots of great conversations about these smoke-filled rooms and how people sort of shouting at each other and that kind of thing. And I think that what I regret about that is that in my work as a resident at the settlement house, it's been difficult to do things that feel small p political there, to open up conversations and debates that feel like they touch on some of these spaces. But I see a bit more optimism than maybe the previous panel did about things like assisted dying, because I can see that people have been having conversations around that very naturally and very organically without, opening up debates. People are talking to each other about it, and that's getting right to the heart of questions about ethics, virtue, morality, which come easier to people than people might think. We don't need to set up complicated spaces. People have them at a lunch club, We do a lunch club, 40 people come sit around the table. These are older people. Many of them these are, forgive the pun, live questions, and they're thinking about them intensely. And I think that's actually a source of optimism. And the more time people spend in these spaces, the least that, and this goes back to the point about the question of how we relate to one another, is that the smaller the space for caricature, right? We talked a lot this morning about atomization, and atomization leads to caricatures. And what I've seen in settlement houses is by opening up those sorts of spaces where people have the courage to engage in friendly disagreement about really deeply moral personal issues, we shut down that space and the possibility for caricature. And then finally, I would just say, one of my favorite quotes about what the settlement houses say that they were trying to do was, and this is against this idea of them being sort of Fabian sort of charity or philanthropists about it, was that they were very strident in saying, we're constructive, not palliative. And they also said, we're permanent, not temporary. And I think both of those things are really beautiful kind of creeds for institutions that try to kind of augment and harness working class power to achieve deeper societal change.
It's been absolutely wonderful listening to Maurice and Francis. A very quick point, what Maurice is saying about universities. I twitch every time I think about universities. And I spent 20 years not getting tenure at a university. And finally, I'm free and I don't give a shit anymore. But it's a punishing place for reflective people. And what Jose was talking about earlier about the need for contemplation, you can't get it at a university. It's incredibly full of pointless tasks and mind-numbing, idiotic requirements, and an administration that hates you. So it's if this is liberalism, well, and it's fascinating to me to see things like Unheard arise, that the life of the mind is finding other mediums. And I don't know if there's a future for the university, as much as I love this place, but the life of the mind needs new ways forward, and it's happening. To Francis, I agree entirely. I go to my daughter's high school, and she's 15, and I talk to the kids there. They slot me in very sweetly of them, and I talk about the nature of beauty, goodness, and truth. I talk about high metaphysics, and they are hungry and keen. And you don't need to be an academic to have an interest in these things.
Especially not.
Absolutely. So, yes, we need to recover the life of the mind, and we need to go to the people. Thank you.
So hands are going up all over Cambridge. We have a roving mic. If you'd like to go 1, 2, 3 along the front, and then we'll do the next row. Do 3 in a row.
Could you give your name, please?
Hi, Gabriel Brom. Great panel, thank you. I just spent the last few months teaching at a university in rural Michigan, and when I wasn't in this world that you described perfectly, I was out registering voters at gun shows and knife shows in the area, and sometimes gun and knife shows. What I noticed, what I was struck by listening to your panel, was that the folks I was registering to vote had some idea of what was going on in the universities. Actually, they would have understood your description quite well. And my colleagues, however, wanted nothing to do with the people around and really had no idea what was, a 5, 10, 15-minute drive, however far you want to go in any direction. They wouldn't dream of it. They were teaching Judith Butler and worrying about cyborgs and transgenderism as if the elections that we were dealing with weren't happening. And I tried to tell some of them, you're going to be the losers. You need to learn what's going on. And that was the end of me, more or less, as far as that goes. I mean, being the only out-of-the-closet person who wasn't a Kamala Harris supporter, really, on campus. And so I wonder, considering what Francis was saying, if maybe the folks, the working class folks that have some idea what time it is, maybe should do a service and come to the university and start living amongst the faculty. In other words, my serious question is there any hope for educating the faculty, or are they just finished? Because it's they that don't know what the people are talking about. The people have some idea what the faculty are doing.
Can I just say one word in response to this? John will remember, once at Labour Party conference, I said, why don't we close down half the universities and turn them into vocational colleges? It wasn't well received. I could just say that this self-righteousness of the academics, they are they're completely desecrated. They're without sin. They humiliate people. They don't know what they're talking about. They regurgitate 5-year-old essays perpetually. And yet they're untouchable. I mean, we've really got to have a decimation of the institutions, I think.
One of them said to me, I don't have to care what those people think. I tried to say, in a public...
Put another way,
we don't have to care.
My biggest regret in life is that my children went to university. Like, genuinely. That I wish it was another way.
Can we take the next question? It was, the three that we've received.
Thank you for such an interesting and diverse panel. I really enjoyed all of your contributions. I really appreciated Paul's homing in on the most abstruse but also concrete issue at the centre of the crisis of contemporary capitalism and civil society, which is the question of truth. So I have an equally abstruse question for you. Do you see any cause for hope on the subject of objective truth in the work which is ongoing among contemporary philosophers and metaphysicians to map hylomorphism onto post-atomic physics?
I do. Aristotle.
There was the third one along the front. Where's Sebastian? We were doing yes.
Sure. I guess I was just kind of wondering about the opposition between liberalism and I guess freedom and liberty, right? Because I guess they're opposed, right? And so, but that does seem to be ultimately, in terms of a principle, the principle is about liberty, which at one time was the purpose of liberalism, is to promote liberty. And so I feel like that ideal needs to be held on to, and you want to hold on to that ideal, but that what's happened is there's a criticism of a kind of this involution, and I think that actually what I see is that involution of anti-liberty is really rooted in the kind of anti-capitalism of academics. Yeah, academics are leftist, anti-capitalist, and this is the problem. And I think we need to recognize some of the real advances that capitalism has brought us. I mean, capitalism has been one of the biggest boons of the world, really, since the last couple of hundred years.
I just want to respond to that very quickly. We've got a conversation to have. I don't think it's appropriate to have it here in public, because I think but just to say that liberalism, there's 4 fundamental liberties in the ancient constitution that we have. Liberty of association, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. what liberalism did is develop that into a system of rights. So I'm pro-liberty, anti-rights, just to say. And capitalism was enforced with incredible violence and violation of liberty. I mean, for 100 years, I mean, one of the things is you weren't allowed to associate. Trade unions were illegal. I mean, the fight for the liberties was also to resist commodification, the desire in capitalism to turn everything sacred into a commodity. Nature, human beings. It's a relentless pressure to desacralize and exploit. So this identification of capitalism with progress is the classic mistake. So I'm just putting it there and saying that I'm really open to a cup of tea in the break. Okay?
I did this person and then all this at the back of this.
This is coming, I think, maybe out of Thomas Chacko, by the way, out of Maurice's earlier comment about reform sweeping the working class. And it's that there's a difference between the working class finding its political voice and people simply being unhappy enough that they've started disobeying the establishment. And I certainly remember hoping that Brexit was the first, and I think finding out that it was the second. Because Francis has been talking about how the settlement movement did incubate political life and political careers 100 years ago. And obviously the trade unions, when we still really had organised labour, did that too. But are there any real signs of hope there? Or are we going to wait for another 40 years before we actually have a new politics arising out of this? And I'd flag up on that I think we're very, very different from America. America has a much more living political culture, I think, and local political culture. So I don't think we can say that because they do have local working class politics in America, we have it here.
Should we take a few questions?
We've still got some more questions. There's the young man back there in cream.
So I was, Ethan Green. So I was just interested in the dichotomy between liberalism as espoused intellectually by figures like Locke, with its emphasis on freedom, and then liberalism as practiced as a political force where it represents potentially just the class interests of the bourgeoisie. So what I mean by this is historically liberalism was more of a, I would say, democratizing force. But it was insofar as the key threat to individual liberties and people's property was from the king. And now as you've got a sort of increased democratization and kind of class consciousness, the biggest threat of it seems to be to those figures comes more from democratic movements. So that's why you then start to see liberal internationalism and this sort of like move away from liberalism being a democratic force to it being more of an autocratic and centralizing one. And I was wondering, if you look at liberalism in those terms, could that potentially explain the rise of the sort of liberal managerialist states, where what you're seeing is that kind of like middle class type of person going from, you know, the sort of local shopkeeper to being the type of person that stuffs the civil service or gets HR positions in various corporations. And that, therefore, is the thread that can marry together how you have what's this tradition, which seems to have so many contradictions within itself.
The creamy guy.
Sebastian.
The creamy guy.
Oh, yeah, but we're doing the dimple thing, you know.
Okay. Okay. So thank you so much, all three. This was really good. I just have to say that. I'm Eirik from the University of Bergen in Norway. Again, another university. And that's the question. Should I? And I will not be offended if you actually mean this. Should I just abandon post? But essentially, is there any value in young academics trying to work within a system that they feel are working against them? Or are they just wasting their powers and energies and just developing vanity?
if I'd had one ally publicly where I was, it would have made a difference. Just have one.
It's interesting you didn't.
Are we taking one more question, then we'll have the panel.
Building upon your comment, really, Graham Salisbury, ex-HR director, current academic, with responsibility for curriculum development. You can pray with me at lunchtime. So, Maurice, what caused you to leave academia? And Paul, what's keeping you there?
I'm not there anymore. Yes, I'm not there anymore. I am an honorary fellow at the University of Queensland, which means I supervise PhDs for free. And because they don't pay me, they send me all these emails to do this internal stuff, and I ignore them, and they can't do anything about it. Yes. Maurice, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I would say certainly when I was an academic, I defined freedom as delete unread. That was really the most fantastic thing to do, was not even read it, just delete, 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 delete. Because the weight of that becomes incredibly oppressive. And really, let's have a cup of tea if you want to talk about it all. Look, we're here at Cambridge. Cambridge really developed collegial scientific freedom. I mean, it's a primary institution. But you notice that the stress is on increasing centralisation, but it's also the academic groupthink. I mean, honour to Kathleen Stock, who's here, but that pressure, that relentless condemnation, what led me to leave academia, Brexit, is that my colleagues really turned foul. I mean, very ugly, very, very ugly condemnation of this as a sort of fascist, racist. I mean, and it was very ugly and very personal. And I couldn't find any reason to stay in that environment, but then I realised I was in the Labour Party, so there was no remission, really. But at least there were some old trade union leaders who showed a degree of understanding and solidarity on that. Look, you've got to love truth, you've got to love beauty, you've got to find friends. I mean, it's just to understand, like we understand with capitalism, commodification, centralisation, managerial control. Universities have become organs of the state, and they also have that similar pressure to conformity and then ostracism and exclusion. So make some friends is really the best thing I can say.
I'd like to speak very quickly to these two young men here. I have 3 daughters at universities, and I'm glad they're there, but they will never get an academic job, and they know that because they've seen me. So it's a great place to learn, even if it's still got inertia, even though it's going downhill. There's still something there. So I would say stick with it if you can get a piece of paper out of it and move on. But to the second question, so I'm a big fan of Jacques Ellul. I don't know if you've read any of his Technological Society, that sort of stuff, okay? So the society we live in is geared towards efficiency, not meaning. And liberalism is the perfect excuse for that, and it's a problem.
It's not efficient.
Absolutely not. It's not efficient, it's not free.
Now, I want to get some more questions in our last 5 minutes. There's one over here, Sebastian, and then there's one behind in blue on them.
Let's get a woman asking a question, please.
I'll happily pass the mic.
Let's ask the hardest question.
But as the mic's with me, I'll put a question. David Campanale, Christian Democrat, apparently masquerading as a Liberal Democrat parliamentary candidate. The focus in an academic place has been on freedom in academia, but I just want to affirm that everything you've said applies to the world of so-called liberal politics, having been through 24 hours of party interrogation, 13 party panels, a solicitor, forensic investigator-led inquiry as to whether I'd done anything wrong. I was exonerated, but his report was set aside. The question I've got focuses, as we're talking about show trials, Stalin famously said, history shows us there are no invincible armies. And the picture you've portrayed this morning seems to suggest such. And I just wonder if I might put a question to Francis. Thank you for your presentation. And I think that true freedom and liberty is found in the sorts of institutions and places that you're working in or building. And I just wonder what your observations might be about a politics of hope, because what's been described today seems pretty depressing.
Should we just take the last question and then Francis can respond? Is that okay?
My question is also directed to Francis. My name is Patrick Shine, and I used to live not far from you in Blackfriars Road.
Oh, yeah.
But now I live in West Wales. And my question is, to what extent did settlements have an equivalent in the rural areas? Because the weird connectivity I observe is the sense of marginalisation. One is cultural and geographical, but as someone who lived in Southwark, there's a lot of marginalised people there too. And it seems to me that there might be a parallel.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I'll take that question first, but actually also to just pick up on the previous round, what I'm going to say, everything I'm going to respond is linking to this theme of practice. And I say practice because if we accept what you have said, which I think you're absolutely right, is just, it's not the working class who need saving, then a lot of this relates to this idea of how do people get experience of and build their skills and confidence in conversation, disagreement, exploration of morality and ethics, which used to be common in these institutions we're talking about, and still is, and people have an appetite for it, and people are seeking it in many different places. So firstly, on this question also of the linking of the two, I would say what I find also really interesting in relation to academia. So I also was somebody who was attracted back to academia having left. I had already had a foot in to a camp of doing this work, and then the entire year I was doing my masters, I was just spending very little time writing my thesis and very little, much more time doing that. But my response would be to echo Paul and say, don't you pick one or the other. The best if you can do is straddle. The best you can do is straddle these spaces, and at Compass we do a lot of straddling of spaces, electoral and non-electoral, between parties, ground-based operations, and because you want to cross-pollinate, sorry, I know that's sort of a cliche, but I think it's extremely important that people exist and don't just pick a side, don't just pick another space. Try to bring what you think is valuable from one space into another space, and I think that was one of the ideas of the settlement. Just on that point, for anybody interested in how settlements also got consigned to the dustbin of history, I would say a really interesting example of this is Richard Titmuss at the LSE, who's the kind of founder of sociology. His break from sociology and social work, that divergence is extremely interesting because it's this break away from practice. So there what you also have is a gender divide, which is that the women went off to do the social work. Social work became degraded. It became something which nowadays social workers don't earn very much, right? We're back to the care agenda and hopefully what David Goodhart is going to speak to later. And then the sociologists, predominantly men in the academy, theorized about it. And we've got institutions which we've got social work which has now become not seen as a craft, not seen as something which has got status and care and relation and is difficult, not just physically but mentally and psychologically, and I think that's really important. That's just a mirror of that. Then just finally about this question about rural settlements, I'm really glad you mentioned that. I also come from a rural area, and I think that I was shocked and felt deeply alienated arriving in London without having a sense of purchase to any. I had no foothold. It felt extremely kind of disorientating until I found the settlement where you get catapulted to the heart of the local community and get in touch with working class people, because where I grew up, it was naturally cross-class, naturally based in things like ritual and tradition. I mean, it sounds Concrete Bumpkin-esque, but when I moved to London, I didn't realise that people didn't celebrate Whitsun anymore, and people, not quite didn't dance around the maypole, but there was a little bit of that stuff. I was like, and nowadays, just to your point, I see a rich seam in also the folk tradition, because I play in a folk band, and I'm fascinated by this idea of rediscovering English folk traditions as a radical social history, as a place of talking about politics, and as a way of, back to your internationalist, not globalist, connecting to other cultures around the world, which, hang on, they're all very similar folk dances when you go to other countries, is working class culture. So I would say a lot about the rural tradition have to offer us is they haven't actually lost a lot of that. And I still go back home to Whit Friday, if anyone knows, in the brass band competitions, which is something which attracts people from all over the world for precisely that reason, that it's rooted and anchored in genuine working class culture.
Just to conclude, David, I'm not spreading a message of doom here. I mean, we're living in glorious times. Obviously, Brexit was great, but the election of Trump is a really hopeful moment in this journey because it breaks that authoritarian liberalism in a very important way and opens space for precisely working class people to start being able to form a politics. And I do think that that's what the future is going to be. It's going to be essentially, Paul, a Catholic social thought working class politics on one side and a sort of transhuman oligarch politics, and that's a space we can engage in. So David, you're a man of faith, be of good faith, and don't despair, for sure.